My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Today, I want to get back to my roots, get back to the roots of Chinese literature, and do a Li Bai poem. Li Bai is probably the most famous figure in Chinese literature. We've done some podcasts on him before. Reading Li Bai for me was one of those things that before I began to intensively study Chinese, it drew me into the study of Chinese literature. I remember during my salad days reading his poetry in translation and being stunned. I was shocked by the economy of the poetry, how Li Bai was able to communicate so much with so few words. I was enchanted by the values he espouses. Here is a man who thinks deeply on a philosophical level, but he also likes to get drunk. But he finds a way to tease out philosophical meaning in his drunkenness. When I first began studying Chinese poetry, Li Bai's writings were one of those things that were so far outside the purview that I had brought up in that it was just really hard to understand him, but also extremely fascinating. Maybe Americans are particularly puritanical, but I think it's hard to find other figures in world literature who can take alcohol and advance it to a metaphysical issue. Okay, that is enough of my boozy meditations and meanderings. And yes, if you were wondering, I am drinking for this episode, as I normally do. I have a Mexican Mocha Imperial Espresso Stout from a local Eugene brewery called Oakshire. And yes, it is mandatory. Every time you talk about Li Bai, you must drink. Of course, my Muslim and Mormon and other teetotaling friends are exempt from this policy, but here at this podcast, I will always drink when discussing Li Bai as a rule. Okay, let's get to the poem. Here's some stuff you need to know about the poem before we actually read the poem itself. This poem is called 下中南山过虎斯山人宿置酒. The English title, as I am translating it, is Going Down to Zhongnan Mountain with Mountain Man Husi, staying at his place and hitting the bottle. This is the fifth poem in the collection of 300 of the most important Tang Dynasty poems, creatively enough titled Tang Shi 300首, that is, 300 poems from the Tang Dynasty. We don't actually know when this poem was written. It might have been 730 AD, it might have been 742 AD. Li Bai was in Chang'an, that is the Tang Dynasty capital, at each of those times. And the mountain he is talking about, Zhongnanshan, and the mountain he is talking about, Final South Mountain. That's a very rough translation. It is just south of Chang'an, in present-day Shanxi, near the city of Xi'an. The mountain is sometimes called Bishan or Jade Mountain. Another possible year, so he might have written it in 730, he might have written it in 742, or he might have actually written it in 752. This is the year when Li Bai actually went to live at this particular mountain, Zhongnanshan Mountain, as a recluse. This is a common thing, particularly for folks associated with Taoism, as Li Bai was. In terms of placing this poem within the Chinese poetic tradition, he's clearly drawing off the Tianyuan genre of poetry. This genre of poetry is sometimes translated into English as field and garden, but I don't know, that almost sounds like a magazine title. It really doesn't do justice to this genre of poetry. I'll call it field and garden just to make things easier, but it doesn't really do it justice. It sounds way too domesticated. This genre of poetry was started by the famous 4th, 5th century poet Tao Yuanming. He wrote these poems about hanging out in nature. Usually he's getting drunk, but not always. I think y'all might see a theme here. Tao Yuanming is, bar none, the most important figure in Chinese poetry before the Tang Dynasty. A lot of these poets after him are reading him. There are some other poets that are writing about the same time that are kind of impressive, but none are impressive as Tao Yuanming. The poetry that comes before Tao Yuanming, there's a reason I haven't done any of it on the podcast. There is plenty of poetry that's been produced in that period before Tao Yuanming, but it doesn't really, it's not super interesting except for maybe historical reasons. The most important thing you need to know about Tao Yuanming and this genre of poetry that he invented called field and garden poetry is that They are all about the poet living in nature. He's rejecting that mainstream life, becoming a government official. He goes out into the wilds, which is really just kind of oftentimes the suburbs. Think Henry David Thoreau, when he goes to Walden Pond, he's just, I think, 2 miles from his mama's house. This is wild in that sort of Thoreauic sense. I think that's enough background. Let's just dive right into the poem. I'm going to read my English translation, but one thing I want to point out before I do that is that this poem is organized, not only is it in the genre of field and garden poetry, but it's organized as a 无言古诗. That really just means something like 5-word, old-style poem. I can discuss this some other time, but the main thing you need to know is that in the Chinese, each line is constructed with 5 characters. That's 5 zi. And the first 2 characters of the line, you'll have something happen, and it's kind of answered in the final 3 characters in the line. Technically, for those of y'all who are literature nerds, the space in between characters 1 and 2 and characters 3 and 4 is called a caesura. I'm not using this term just to impress all of y'all, but it really is hard to talk about poetry without sometimes using this kind of technical language. Okay, now let's jump into the poem, or my English translation of it. Here we go. Dusk follows up from the bottom of the Jade Mountain. The mountain moonlight follows me as I return. Yet I look back at the path I came along. The green light cuts horizontally across the mountain air. Holding hands, me and Husi walk over to his field and home. Kids open the doors to the little shack. The green bamboo penetrates the peaceful path. The green vines grab at the clothes as we walk. I happily chat with Husi, hanging out. Together, we booze it up, shaking the last drops out of the glass. We sing the long song, Pine Tree Winds. By the time the song is done, it is late and the Milky Way is bright. I am drunk and he is way drunker. We are happy, caring about nothing. So let's look at lines 1 and line 2. Just to remind you, lines 1 and 2 are, dusk follows up from the bottom of the Jade Mountain. The mountain moonlight follows me as I return. Okay, in that first line, dusk is moving up the mountain. Then the moonlight is moving with him as he too goes up the mountain. In Chinese, there's a kind of parallel in the verb that's used in these 2 lines. Cong in that first line just means follow, and sui in that second line also means follow. There's this sense that with that verb sui, the moonlight almost seems erotic. It's like a woman is following him. There's something weird going on that it's hard to translate into English, but the moonlight seems to not be acting like moonlight, but be acting like a lover in coming after him. In lines 7 and 8, you have a similar parallelism happening. The green bamboo penetrates the peaceful path. The green vines grab at the clothes as we walk. So first off, the greens in these 2 lines are different. They're different characters. He's not repeating himself as it sounds kind of clumsily in English. He's actually using 2 different words for the word green. English just doesn't have as good of a language to talk about the different greens as does Chinese. The image that we see in lines 7 and 8 is Li Bai walking with this hermit Husi, this mountain man, this guy who lives in the mountains and tries to stay away from civilization. You have these 2 different things blocking them as they're trying to walk along the overgrown pathway. In line 7, it's bamboo that's almost phallically penetrating the path. In line 8, there's the sense that the vines are kind of grabby. If in line 2, moonlight was kind of acting like a lover, it's kind of being personified by Li Bai's use of verbs, there's something similar going on. Before I said that this particular type of poetry is divided up. It's got 5 characters, and in character 1 and 2 is answered by characters 3, 4, and 5. And there is this parallelism also in between odd lines and even lines. So what happens in line 1 is kind of answered in line 2. Both of these kinds of parallelism are crucial in sort of the driving force of Chinese poetry. In English poetry, it's rhyming that kind of functions as the driving force in a poem. If you have a good rhyme, it has that rhythm, it works out. In Chinese poetry, the same thing is true for parallelism. Actually, parallelism is much more important in Chinese poetry than rhyming. Okay, that was a good bit about the structure of the poem. Let's talk about what actually happens. Li Bai arrives at the mountain, or at the base of the mountain, on the cusp of night. This mountain is right south of the capital, Chang'an, as I said, modern-day Xi'an. I imagine him racing south across the plain where the capital sits and getting to the foot of the mountain late in the afternoon. He seems almost to be racing the night. He goes up the mountain just as dusk is moving along the slopes. He turns back and he looks over the road that he has already traveled. In Chinese, line 4 is incredibly pretty. The green light cuts horizontally across the mountain air. In the original Chinese, there is the sense that the air is almost like a string pulled tight. As the light of dusk comes over it, it sort of plucks at that string, and there is just this vision of an emerald vibrato sort of shaking in the air. Of course, none of that's possible, but it kind of plays into what I was discussing before about the way natural objects in this poem become personified just by Li Bai's use of sort of clever language, particularly his use of verbs. You almost have the sense that things like air, vines, bamboo, moonlight, they're all coming to life. It's an incredibly rich poem, both in what it says, but also in the way language gives life to these natural forces. Okay, all of a sudden, we see in the poem, Li Bai has met Husi. I translated Husi's title as Mountain Man. That is the literal Chinese, Shanren. But I should point out, don't understand Mountain Man as if this is some American backwoods figure who embodies independence and this is the middle of nowhere. It's more like a hermit who's kind of living on the edge of society. This is a guy who is living out there away from the city, away from high society, but he's not necessarily going out there hunting for his food. He might be relatively rich and just reading books all day. A mountain man, in this sense, does it in an out-of-the-way place, but kind of like Thoreau, not that far out of the way. This image of a smart drunk living in the mountains goes, again, back to Tao Yuanming and his field and garden poetry. When we meet Husi, we also have this vision of a simplistic life. Kids here are running out of their shacks. The pathway is overgrown by bamboo and vines. And then what do? They get drunk. In Chinese literature, but particularly in Li Bai and Tao Yuanming, drunkenness is oftentimes a metaphor for not serving in an official position in government. Rather, in this metaphor, drunkenness becomes just a symbol of living a life that's carefree, not worrying about official life. In Chinese literature, this tension of whether or not to serve in the government is one of the defining themes of all of the literature, going way back to the 3rd century BC with the Li Sao, supposedly written by Chu Yuan, who, if you've been to China, you know Chu Yuan. They have dragon boat festivals every spring or summer to celebrate his committing suicide in order to try and save the state. You make zongzi, this particular kind of pastry, to celebrate him. With Li Bai in this poem, he's not doing what Chu Yuan did. He's apparently leaving the capital and leaving behind any suggestion that he should serve as a government official. He did briefly serve in the government, but much of his life is defined by not doing the things that as a good person one would be expected to do in a Chinese setting. That is, get a job, work for the government, make sure your family is taken care of. Li Bai doesn't do any of that stuff. Instead, he's going into this natural area. He's embracing the carefree life of joyful alcoholism. That last line, "We're happy, caring about nothing." My translation follows some of the commentaries I was reading, but just in looking at the line and looking how it appears, it probably could be translated something more like, "Looking very merry, we together forget and are carefree." But again, when translating Chinese poetry, one usually goes with the commentaries unless you have a really good reason not to. That last line suggests the sort of Taoist theme of this poem. Embracing drunkenness functions as a way to put things into perspective. Does life matter? Does work matter? Nah. Drink and be merry, for tomorrow we're going to die. That's kind of the message that you get in Zhuangzi. I think he talks about alcohol a bit less, but certainly the sort of Zhuangzian form of Taoism calls on us to put things into perspective. It calls on us to not work hard. It calls on us to not focus too much on doing the things that everybody says are important, but actually they're not important. That is what is going on in this poem. Li Bai is leaving behind officialdom. He's going into the mountains and he's getting drunk with this guy who just sits around all day in the woods. This might seem like something to not aspire to, but I think Li Bai is trying to advocate for a particular lifestyle, a lifestyle of what I called before joyful alcoholism. Don't worry too much about life. Don't worry too much about the nagging sorts of things that you're supposed to do. Make sure you're happy and have a beer while you're at it. Well, I'm just going to leave y'all with a Chengyu that is drawn this time from the Zhuangzi, of course. 避世绝俗. This Chengyu just means to withdraw from society and live as a hermit, which, of course, is what this poem is all about. Before I go, just a reminder, check out my Patreon page, patreon.com/Chinese Literature Podcast. If you want to contribute, I really appreciate folks showing their appreciation of the podcast. If you have any other suggestions on things that you want me to do differently, things you think I'm doing really well, things you think I'm doing incredibly badly, train wreck bad, send me an email at ChineseLiteraturePodcast@gmail.com. That's it for this episode. I am Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.